This title, New Challenges for TA After 50 Years of History, is the one I ended up with eventually. And I'll talk about that, but also offer some comments on the country reports. That was the other big thing asked of us. So you will see it's about 50-50, but I've mixed them a little bit. This 50 years of history, if you take it literally, it would be since 1962. So the whole thing would then start with early warning. But obviously there was other kinds of TA already, and particularly to estimate performance of new technology to be developed in the military sphere, aerospace, and that continues to be an important possibility of TA, which we don't really discuss here because we're focusing on what you could call public TA to push that difference. It's also a story of professionalization since OTA was established. In the American system you have to be good at what you're doing, otherwise you will be shut down. So professionalization occurred. But also integration. And I mentioned here a general move in our societies, at least North America and Europe, Western Europe, towards participatory governance in the 80s more or less. And TA was sort of moving with that. And there are country specifics, of course. And I use here a rather cumbersome phrase of national ecosystem of research and technology to indicate all these various institutions and their interactions and flows, which is a bit like an ecosystem, but it's not necessarily so integrated as an ecosystem is. And these country specifics might actually imply other things, like TA being part of the expression of national identity, the way that in Denmark the consensus conferences have been developed and made part, and a very visible part of TA had to do, as some people have analyzed, with the whole culture where citizens were considered to be knowledgeable, the Folkelige Hochschule culture, and so the Grundtvig thing. So, having said that, I will use the overview that I made in the book chapter, which you have seen. At least I think it was pre-circulated. So you get the 1970s, the first generation OTA. You get the second generation, where participatory approaches were important. It started already in the late 80s, but it was sort of heydays and still is in the 1990s. There is now this sort of speculation about the third generation. This is a phrase used in a Japanese project that I was linked up with a little bit. But at the moment, this notion of third generation is more like a rallying cry. It's still an empty umbrella term, but you can speculate about this idea of coming back to methods, perhaps renewed methods, in order to show the added value of TA after the sort of push for just participation. What you have to add to this, I think, and that again is in my chapter, a broader view on this public TA, which I call a philosophy of TA, reducing the costs of how our society is learning by trial and error about handling of new technology. And you do that through anticipation, the developments and their impacts. And this is in the book chapter if you want to check the details. And the other part, obviously, accommodating such insights in decision making and its implementation. So this covers this thing about knowledge-based policy and advice from TA to decision making, but it doesn't specify that it is a particular TA unit that does that. It's these anticipations must be accommodated from wherever they come. And that's is then, I draw that out, so well, you can say this is a charter for professional technology assessment, or for the way that we here in Vashita meeting are talking about our roles. You can say, okay, refer back to this philosophy of TA as a normative justification for pushing this, in spite of the fact that some of the needs are unrecognized. But delegation to professionals is one possibility. It's not the only one, and that also means that anticipation is not limited to studies. And as I say here, it's part of a societal learning process, and that refers back to how Leo already referred to my notion that controversies can actually be seen as informal technology assessment. And this whole broader philosophy of TA says that this move towards participation in societal agenda building, which is, for example, very visible with the Rathenau Institute in the Netherlands, is not just following what was happening in society, where there was this overall move. It's also something which is, to my mind, essential to TA, if TA is to actually see this philosophy of TA as what it should be guided by. So, the philosophy of TA, you get the participation stuff coming out from that. You also get a link up with broader diagnosis of our society, like risk society or reflexive modernization. These both come from Ulrich Beck, and I'm not pushing Ulrich Beck here, but I'm pushing the notions that are important. So you can continue that. Again, this is from the chapter, by saying, well, you should definitely think in terms of strategic intelligence, which then helps to support this sort of recent idea of anticipatory governance, and that is evolving under circumstances of reflexive modernization. I'm not going into all of these terms or concepts or diagnoses, just highlight them briefly, but they can be seen as actually linked to some of the sort of new TA that has been developing. One would be constructive TA, set up in the late 80s, but actually coming into its own more recently. It introduces technology dynamics as an important tool for technology assessment. It talks about modulation of development. And actually, because of its sort of arranged between stakeholders, it becomes something like neo-corporatist governance. And then the other thing, technology festivals, which have been pioneered by Rathenau Institute. I mean, I see them as an indication of playful technology assessment, because technology assessment has the history of being very concerned and very serious about all these things that go wrong. And that is important, obviously, but it's also something that, particularly in sort of the present times, with lifestyle stuff being important, it should also have a sort of playful element in order to interact with societal learning processes. Parallel development, this is not the only thing, and I just list them very quickly. The whole motion towards reflexive design, reflexive governance. Again, if you want to discuss these things, we could do that, but I'm just mentioning them here for completeness sake, you could say. Transition analysis, which is particular for energy, is coming up strongly. There's this whole notion of responsible innovation. I'll come back to that in the final slides of my presentation. There are codes of conduct now for nanotechnology research, which is really very striking that has happened. It's about desirable behavior, but the point I will be also making later on, it needs analytical assessment tools, and then it overlaps definitely with the tradition of TA. Ethical aspects are taken up increasingly, up to what is sometimes called ethicalization. This is a term from, among others, this European expert group on science and governance, which wrote the report Taking the European Knowledge Society Seriously. It's about some 4 or 5 years ago, and which means that what is actually political decision making or political deliberation and decision making is replaced by a debate about ethics, which there is also some delegation to expert. That is meaning of ethicalization. And not just multi-level, there are secular changes in how these things are considered, particularly if you think in terms of responsible research and innovation. So this secular change point actually starts with a broad diagnosis which has driven us to develop constructive technology assessment. Well, to develop it in a certain direction, let's rephrase it. And one indication is that there are different government ministries for promotion of science and technology and for control of technology. And so you see a sort of division of institutional labor, but you could also call it division of moral labor, in how we handle new technology in society. And this links back to this whole notion of the philosophy of TA, as I said before. What you see now, and that's the secular change, there's much more interest in bridging and in interactions. And you might actually think of a division of labor that might change. And I didn't put that on the slides, but you could say that this move of, for example, the European Commission with its code of conduct and its pushing the notion of responsible research and innovation, that it tries to change the division of moral labor. Because before, the technology promoters would develop technology and then sort of throw it over the fence into society, and that was it. Others would have to take care of the consequences. And now the argument is no, you have to take consequences into account at an early stage. So there's a change in the division of moral labor. And as I said, this policy discourse on responsible innovation is a further indication of bridging this division of labor. You see it not just with the European Commission, you see it also with, in the US, National Nanotechnology Initiative. You see it coming up in some ways in other countries. The European Code of Conduct was of great interest to Argentina, of all places, you could say. So they have been interacting with the European Commission about what they might be able to do. So on the one hand, you could say this is wonderful, and I'm a bit in two minds about that, in two ways actually. One is that some of this thinking and phrasing is very similar to what the critical movement in the 1970s was coming up with, about more interest for consequences, impact, doing something about it, thinking that scientists should be accountable for that. And now suddenly it's not part of a critical movement, it's part of the establishment. So you find yourself, having lived through that whole period, as I have, in a bit of a curious situation. The other thing why I'm in two minds about it is that you see how it actually goes. You see that already certain directions are being articulated through all sorts of interactions. And you could call them reductions, perhaps. Inevitable, but still they are reductions. Has a strong utilitarian sense, or consequentialist ethics, you could call it. There is a definition of the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which says maximize technology's positive contributions and minimize negative consequences. It seems obvious once you say it, but there is really a link with a particular kind of ethics, which is utilitarian, rather than, say, a good life or a virtue ethics. There's also a version which you could call neoliberal, in terms of don't sort of limit freedom of actors. If you avoid causing harm, then everything is okay. And that's how things in practice go with the risk assessment approaches. Also, there is a narrative of containment, which is just one way of handling technology in society. As with nuclear, as with recombinant DNA, and now with nanoparticles, contain them. Then you keep the hazards at bay, and then we can continue with the new technology. And there are the ELSA studies, which are taken up after its early start in the 90s. And you could say, well, that's actually a sort of compensation for this policy push for these new promising technologies, which is everywhere. It's sort of people think in terms of global competition in those terms. And then you have also to do ELSA, otherwise you're not sufficiently legitimate to continue with those technologies. And my own position also in the work on TA of nanotechnology that we've been doing is well, a combination of being practical and being fatalistic, that this will happen anyway. So you could try to keep your hands clean, say, oh no, I'm not going to be a sort of compensation or excuse. In Dutch we even have a rhyming phrase for that, for those people who speak Dutch, the few of us here, excuustrus. Some other people might explain that later in the break. And we have had that experience, that happens. When there was a session in Parliament about nanotechnology, and the people who were pushing, the promoters of nanotechnology, got questions from other participants in that meeting, saying, okay, but this is, if it is so promising, it will have big impacts, also perhaps negative impacts. What about that? And then the guy said, oh no, that's no problem. We've got Arie Rip, you know, he does all that work on constructive TA. And then the discussion was not completely over, but sort of silenced for the moment. So there's lots of stuff going on in a sort of macro and meso level. There are also things going on at the micro level, which I intimated already, but I'll show you a poster which is made for laboratories that in the US that get financed by the National Nanotechnology Initiative. And it says, I consider every aspect of my research, including what happens with it outside of the lab. And that is responsible research in action. And you can analyze the poster in a number of ways. It's a very interesting one. And you can see that here it is focusing on attitudes. This is what I am prepared to do. And I said before already that the key thing is to actually enable people to do it in a productive way with sort of assessment tools. We've trying to do a simple thing which we called fictive script analysis and exploring it with nanotechnologists. So I think it's possible to do that. But it's at the moment, people are actually reluctant to be practical about it. It's for an attitude and something that legitimates their continuing with their work. So, towards my final reflections, it's by way of conclusion, but it's not really a conclusion of what I mean, because I was commenting all the time, and that may be adding up to some overall perspectives. But the primary reflections are again about the country reports and about Pačíta. I would say first that from my presentation now, it must be clear that there is more to TA than is visible in the country reports. And I'm not saying that you should take it up, but since TA is still an empty signifier, you have the possibility to take up more than you're doing now. Then something that came out quite strongly this morning also, that even if you do see yourself just as doing professional service, as TA professionals have been seeing themselves, particularly in the 70s and 80s, it's about change for the better, somehow, even if you don't define what better is. And also a strong conviction that analysis and diagnosis will help. That's the knowledge-based policy stuff. And so you see here both a thrust in the country reports and in Pačíta, and a sort of background assumption that analysis and diagnosis helps. Even if you're not looking at it in terms of professional TA, you could actually say that it is a bit of an occupational bias in Pačíta. This is your charter to do all these things, so you have to include it. Then finally, what would be next steps in TA, in the Pačíta project? And I haven't filled in this because I was thinking about it, and I thought it's more a matter of discussion than of my sort of saying, okay, these are directions to go. But I think in the future, and it's your choice whether you would take that up in Pačíta or not, is that there is a link with overall policy discourses, perhaps secular changes, and particularly for European countries, the link with the European Union and what it's doing. And I have given examples in relation to responsible research and innovation. And at the same time, consider and take into account all sorts of bottom-up activities. I didn't specify all of them, but you saw a number of them. And that implies that technology assessment could now also play the role of mediator between these two types of processes. So that would reduce the element of policy advice and all the puzzles there, and it would emphasize sort of brokering role. And that's, I mean, in the 70s that wasn't really so possible. There was not enough, but now things are going on, and so TA, perhaps not so clearly in some of the present Eastern European countries, but in principle you could say that there might well be movements in that direction, and then again TA could take up something like a mediator. Brokering is perhaps too strong a word, but a role as a mediator between the sort of macro level policy discourse stuff and the bottom-up activities. Those are my final words, at least for the moment. Thank you.